Hi, listeners of the First Draft Club, and hi if you are watching on YouTube. In the last episode, I talked about how a 90% great book is going to get rejections 100% of the time. And today I want to talk more about this. How do you make up that difference? Whether it's a 40% gap, you have a 60% great book and we need to get it to 100, or it's a 5% gap, you have a 95% great book and you need to get it to 100. How do you close the gap if you don't want to give up? And I hope you don't want to give up. The answer is that it's going to be different for everyone. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. And I want to talk about the actions that I recommend. This episode is going to be largely about no longer gaslighting ourselves around this and having an accurate understanding of the situation, because I find that that is really empowering for people who are in the querying trenches. I have been there, I know it well. First, here's the thing. We all bring different skill sets to the task of writing fiction. Some people sit down and are masterful at original language, right? At crafting prose that feels unique and like something a reader hasn't read before. Other people sit down and have an intuitive sense of story. They're really good storytellers. They know how to plot. That comes to them naturally. They can write a page turner in the same way that they could tell a story at the kitchen table that, has everybody like rapt and wide-eyed. Some people are super clever. They're witty. They, have great turns of phrase. Other people are naturally poetic. They're just magical with metaphor. Most of us do not have all of these attributes, right? Like, that's just reality. That is just the reality of being a human being who is writing, which means we're going to have to work in the areas where we are weaker. And this work can be more or less heavy depending on the genre that we're writing in. The genre that we've chosen for a particular project and the conventions to that genre. I know people who are incredibly gifted at prose who are working on thrillers. For them, not all the time, but some of the time, the work part is the plotting. The plotting is the part that they don't do subconsciously. They have to bring active attention to it. They have to work harder on that than they do on the sentences themselves. It's something they have to practice and get better at and experiment with and get wrong before they get right. I know other people working on thrillers who are incredibly great at plot. They just, they're just good at it. They know how to write suspense. But the writing itself is lacking. It falls flat, or they're not getting deep enough into character, or they need to work on the craft of writing the sentences themselves, like on a micro level. They need sentence variation. This may sound overwhelming and a lot of work when I say something like sentence variation, and it is a lot of work. Improving the writing itself, I think, is one of the heaviest lifts there is when it comes to improving one's abilities as a writer. But that does not mean it's impossible, because it's not. And here's the good news. With a skill like that, but honestly, with all of the skills we're talking about here, including plotting, it's the kind of thing where you only have to get better once, because once you're better at it, you're better at it. Like, you get better at getting better. It is a self-perpetuating is the wrong thing. It builds on itself. It snowballs. When you learn how to write better than you used to, that's not something that you're going to lose in your next book, right? You're going to bring the skills you've developed to your next book, and the skills you develop writing that you will take to your next book, and so on. Now, let's apply all of this logic to closing that gap I talked about at the beginning of the episode. When it comes to closing that gap between the book you wrote and the book someone wants to publish, the gap is going to be different for everyone depending on the genre you're writing in and your skill set. For some lucky people, the gap will be really small. Maybe the writing is good, the plot is mostly working. It just needs one twist, or it needs a tweak of the premise to make it stronger, give it a better log line so that professionals, agents and ultimately editors will feel like it's eminently more sellable. I talked about this as an example in the last episode of this podcast, if you want to give that a listen. That is like the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to closing a gap. It's just like when you need a small tweak, you need a twist, you need one kind of discrete change. The gap on the other end of the spectrum, right, is the one I was just talking about where the writing itself needs work. This is the kind of gap that is going to be specific to each person because people have different kinds of writing quirks. And so I'm sorry that I can't just readily say how to fix that one. But what I can say is that it isn't hopeless, especially if the story is good enough. And this leads me to an important footnote if the gap is in the writing itself. If a story has a great enough log line, it buys you more leeway with the writing itself, okay? Just look at, The Hunger Games, for example, okay? And I'm sure we could come up with a million more. There are storylines where an agent, an editor may feel confident that people are going to want to buy and read and have a great reading experience, despite the fact that the writing itself isn't as strong as it could be. This is more rare than we would maybe like or not, depending on maybe on whether we're coming from the perspective of a reader or a writer. But it is the case that a strong log line, a really powerful premise, can take up some of the slack for weaker writing. Now, that said, at some level, if the writing is weak, it is not going to get picked up. There are just too many books out there. There are too many great ideas. There are too many great premises that do have good writing. So it is always going to behoove you as a writer to improve your writing if that is the feedback that you're getting. And again, once you've done it once, you don't have to do it again. In sum, I just want to debunk this idea of there being any kind of binary, people who are good writers and people who aren't, or people, or a book being good enough to publish or a book not being good enough to publish. When I see someone saying they are giving up querying because they're tired of rejection, that's what I see it as someone giving up because they're tired of rejection. There's no part of me that feels like, oh, well, this was inevitable. The book was never going to make it. Because the truth is, any book can make it. I mean, maybe that's like a Pollyanna thing to say, but it's just the question of how much work it takes. And listen, when I say that what I see it as is what it is, which is someone giving up because they're tired of it, I'm not saying they're doing the wrong thing. I am not here to say never give up. Never give up querying one particular project. I would never say that. We all need to balance our artistic lives with our actual lives. And at some point, walking away might be the right thing for someone as a life choice or moving on to another project. I've certainly done it. I'm saying that when one makes that choice, I don't think it's because the book was like never going to make it or something. I think it's often because either the author isn't sure what the next steps are to close that gap, and maybe they perceive the steps, the work that needs to be done as being bigger than it really is, in which case I find it kind of tragic. Or the author is just tired of working on the project, which is fair. I mean, the place where I think the thing that I find kind of the most haunting and disappointing on a cosmic level is the idea that someone, including myself, all of us, would give up on a project because we believe that gap to be bigger and more daunting than it really is. It's like if someone sets aside a project because they think that gap entails 200 hours of work and they don't know where to begin, when really that gap entails 4 hours of work, and then someone would gobble up the project and we would all love it for years. That haunts me because this idea of like there being 95% great projects sitting in desk drawers, potentially never to be read by anyone, it just is sad. It makes me sad. And so These days, when I set a project aside for myself, in my mind, it's not dead. It's not dead in the water. I have plays I've written, I have poems I've written, I have a TV pilot I've referenced before that I wrote with my best friend about debutantes and a secret terrorist organization. All of these are in, proverbial desk drawers, but I don't think of them as dead. I think of them as like, boots on a shelf that I might one day get down and wear again when they come back in style. That's it. I see them as potential. I see them as creative projects that are still in progress, and I just happen not to be actively working on them right now. Maybe the world wasn't ready for them yet, or they weren't ready for the world yet. But maybe one day I will choose to get them down and work on closing that gap. So, if you are getting rejections and you are hitting a wall, it may be time to set a project aside, sure, but that doesn't mean it has to be the end. If you do choose that path, I encourage you to think about it more as stepping away from something that taught you a lot and still could teach you more potentially if and when you're ever ready. And if you're not ready to step aside, it's a matter of figuring out what is at the heart of that gap between where your book is now and where it needs to be. And then navigating what you need to do to get it to the so-called 100% spot. Thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next episode.